All right, how's everybody? It's chapter 10, Food Safety Management Systems. So we're going to go through this chapter. We're going to talk about the HACCP plan and all the different steps for that. So here, the Food Safety Management Systems is a group of practices and procedures intended to prevent foodborne illness. So what it does is it actively controls the risks and the hazards at each step of the process. So when you're looking at pulling something, let's say I'm going to cook some whole chickens, I'm going to roast a chicken. And, you know, in the industry, we never do one, we're doing 50, 100. So you're going to pull them out. So you're looking at the different steps in the process that where can something go wrong? Where can the foodborne illness occur? Where can it get cross-contaminated? Where, you know, at what point is there a critical point? Okay, so it's kind of looking for those, and that's what the HACCP plan is. And I'll go definitely into a lot more detail as we talk about the flow of food and managing those systems. So here, you want to have a good foundation. You want to make sure that you have the personal hygiene program. So, you know, when I worked in a hotel, we used to, my jackets got laundered by them. I would pick up a brand new jacket in the morning, and when I left that evening, I would drop them off. And so every day I had a laundered jacket. It was clean. I never had to worry about any of my cooks or anybody not having a clean uniform. And some, you know, big hotels, country clubs, they have those kind of systems in place because they're worried about the personal hygiene and making sure that people are wearing nice, clean uniforms and there's no illnesses going in it. Food safety programs, that's your ServSafe. You know, one of the biggest things is get people trained, teach people, train people. The more that you train, the better off you are. Now, I'll tell you this, a lot of people, they go through ServSafe training, but nobody's watching them, nobody's giving them any feedback, and what happens is they go back to anyways, shortcuts, all those things, and you know what, people are getting people sick. So it definitely is, you know, once you go through a training process, it's really using those tools. And as a manager, you need to make sure that you're looking at your cooks and you're telling them, you know, hey, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing that, and giving feedback because feedback is everything. Holding people to a standard. You know, at the end of the day, it's the chef's position. That's, if they're not holding you to a standard, it's really their fault. Okay. So supplier selection, again, it's approved, reputable suppliers. You want to be using them. You want to be having a cleaning and sanitizing program. We had a steward program at the hotel too, where we had an executive steward who he managed everything. He made sure that, you know what, the silverware was being washed properly and that it was clean. Have you ever worked in a place or gone someplace and literally you pull something and it's just dirty and gross because it just hasn't been cleaned properly? So, you know, you can have those systems in place. The other is standard operating procedures. Standard operating procedures is SOPs, and that is having standards in place. You know, some places have those, some places don't. Great example, some kitchens will have a recipe book that you can use, and everybody's making the same Alfredo sauce because they're using that recipe. Some places you go in and, you know what, one day somebody's making the Alfredo sauce, and another day you got another guy making the Alfredo sauce, and they taste too different because nobody is making sure that it's the same thing every day. So standard operating procedures are really making sure that things are in a set way. It has the same process and everybody's doing that same process. Everybody's been trained in it. But training is the key to all of this. You want to have pest control. You want to make sure that people are walking your property to make sure that, you know what, there are no pests. You know, it's easy for rats and roaches and animals to get into your property, especially if you have sliding doors or anything like that. And then maintenance. You want to make sure that your equipment is maintained, it's cleaned, it's organized, and that you have somebody that you can call when the refrigerator goes down, the freezer goes down, the oven goes down. Are the ovens calibrated? Are they cooking at the proper temperature? If I put my oven to 500 degrees and I leave it there for an hour and I come back, is it 500 degrees? If it's not being properly maintained. So you got to make sure that you have maintenance crew taking care of those things. actively managing control, purchasing from, you want to make sure that, you're purchasing from a safe provider. Cooks, they can fail to cook food adequately. Let's say they don't have their thermometer right here, or it's not even calibrated, or they're not even using it, and those things happen. Holding food at incorrect temperatures. If you're not reheating it to a correct temperature and making sure that, it's above 165 degrees when you reheat something, guess what? You're going to get people sick. So it's, making sure of all those things. Contaminated equipment, and then practicing poor personal hygiene. And that's, again, people aren't washing their hands, people aren't using gloves, people aren't using tongs, nothing. They're touching the food with their bare hands and giving it to the guest. Ways to achieve this is training programs, managers, supervision, and supervision is everything. You're either a manager who's walking around or you're a manager sitting in the office. There's no in between. I've seen it all. I've seen managers who, they're in an office and they don't know what's going on. I'm one of those, and I'm in the depths. I'm elbow to elbow with my cooks. I always was like that. Because it's the only way that really what's happening. Standard operating procedures, making sure those are in place, and then having a HACCP plan. Okay, so the steps for, I want to go to the HACCP plan. HACCP is a Hazardous Analysis Critical Control Point program. And that's what HACCP stands for. You need to know what that is, because I will tell you it'll be on your certification exam. But it's a significant hazards at points within the flow of food through an operation where you can have a biological hazard, a chemical hazard, or a physical hazard. And it's preventing and eliminating those places to make sure that you're at safe levels. So this plan one, it's written. It has set places that you have to fill everything out. You have to monitor temperatures, all of those things. So it must be specific to each facility and the menu. So what, let's say, the Marriott does at their place cannot be used at Carrabba's. Each place has to have their own individual HACCP plan because they have their own processes. And you want to make sure that it's a plan that works, that it works for your company and for your kitchen. Because if you're using something else, it's not going to work. The 7 HACCP principles is conduct a hazard analysis, determine the critical control points, establish critical limits, establish monitoring procedures, identify corrective actions, verify the system works. And that's the biggest thing, is coming around and looping and seeing that it works, and then establish procedures for recording and documenting. Because at the end of the day, when you have the health department come in and check you, they're going to be checking that paperwork if you have a HACCP plan in place. So number 1, conduct a hazardous analysis, identify potential hazards. So here what you're trying to do is you're trying to look at where in the different process of the flow of the food, that where can there be a hazard? Where is there a chemical hazard, or a biological or a physical hazard that, something can get contaminated. So you really want to identify those points in the process of the flow, okay, of what you're doing. 2, determine the critical control point. Find the processes where identify hazards can be prevented or eliminated. Sometimes it's preventing, it's making sure that, hey, you know what, don't pull all the chicken that you're using out all at once. Just pull out what you need and then go grab and get more. So you want to determine these places, and you want to make sure that your cooks are trained. Establish critical limits. And here is, this is where you're looking at the critical limit is, our oven cooks at this temperature, and that if you cook a piece of chicken for this long, it's done. Now, does that, if I tell you, hey, cook a piece of airline chicken breast for, 20 minutes after you seared it, is it going to be done? No, not necessarily. If it's bigger, smaller. So I always have to use my thermometer. I always have to make sure that that's in place. And it's guiding. A lot of my students, I always am like, cook it until it's done. And they're like, well, how long is that? And I'm like, until it's done. Because, you know, if you're cooking it at home, if you're cooking it at work, it all depends on the oven you're using. It all depends on how large the piece of meat is, or the, you know, let's say I'm doing a scallop potato, if I'm doing a small amount for a couple of people, or if I'm doing it for 20 people, it's a whole different process. It's going to cook longer, so you got to cook it until it's done. And so it's kind of understanding that. You know, if I'm making a cheesecake, if I make a whole cheesecake, guess what? It's going to take about 40 minutes for it to cook. But if I make little individual cheesecakes, it doesn't take 40 minutes to cook. It only takes about 20. So, you know, I've had students who are cooking that for 40 minutes. I'm like, oh, you just burn it. And they're like, it's overcooked. Yep. And if you pull out the whole one and you only cooked it for 20 minutes, guess what? If you didn't check it, then it's undercooked. So it's kind of preventing those limits, especially when you're establishing critical limits for that. 4 is establish monitoring procedures. And, you know, how are we going to check it? Using our thermometers is a huge one. Thermometers, guess what? It shows you, you know what, I can sit here and I can touch it, but you know what, it really doesn't tell me the temperature. So, you know, using that is everything. Identifying who will monitor it. So you want to have people in place for that too. 6, verify that the system works. Determine if the plan is working as intended. You want to have monitoring charts. You want to be recording them, and you want to have you want to be preventing and identifying these things. And you want to be honest. You know what? I'll tell you. I worked at a place, and all of a sudden we transitioned hotels, and it was a Swiss hotel, and then we transitioned it to the Westin Buckhead, which is in Atlanta. And when I transitioned it, the Westin had a HACCP plan. And so 6 months later, they're like, okay, we need to get these in place. And the chef is, you know, sitting there in the office writing, you know, lying about all these numbers. They didn't do it. So, you know what, if you have these plans, you want to make sure that you're monitoring, that you're doing this on a daily basis, that you're recording these temperatures, that you know what's going on, because having them in place and not using them, it doesn't help you. So definitely it's verifying that the system works. 7, establish procedures for recording them. You want to have your monitoring your temperatures. You want to have your corrective actions. You want to validate your equipment. You know, is your oven working? You know, let's say usually I cook my chicken. It only takes 20 minutes and it's not done after 20. Okay, well, I need to look at my oven and see what's happening. Working with suppliers, invoices, specifications. The big thing is having your certain specifications is knowing that, you know what, if I'm going to get a airline chicken breast. The airline chicken breast it has the wing on it, and it has the skin. So it's a chicken breast that has the wing. It's a nice little, it's a nice piece of meat. But you want to make sure that I'm getting a 6 ounce or an 8 ounce, that I'm getting the certain specifications every time, that they're not changing every month or every 2 weeks, that, you know, you have specifications when you're ordering. So it's having those things in place too. Then they talk about the fruit basket. I'm going to let you read about that because it just kind of goes through the process. Because this is a long chapter, I wanted to so now I'm on slide 30 if you wanted to go to that. To create a crisis management team, and the team's going to depend on the size of the operation. Larger operations are going to have larger teams. Usually I've been on sanitation teams that, you know, we're monitoring, we're working every month, and we're meeting and having our meetings and looking at those things. Usually you want to make sure that your team is in place, and that they know what they need to do. You want to prepare for a crisis. So, you know what, here's the thing. It's not if a crisis is going to happen, it's when is a crisis going to happen, because they're going to happen. The first hotel that I worked at, when I got out of culinary school, I was the restaurant chef and sous chef at the Partridge Inn. This was back in 97, 98. And I'll never forget, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a phone call. Your kitchen was on fire. And we had a little fire. It wasn't a big fire, but it was a little fire, and it was an electrical fire. And the Ansel systems went off, and the whole kitchen was shut down for about 2 days. It took about 2 days to get that place cleaned, and literally we were cleaning it for 24 hours. But it's, who are you going to call? Who's going to talk to, who's going to be the spokesperson that's going to talk to the media or anybody? So it's kind of having the systems in place for when the crisis happens, because it is going to happen. It's not when, it's not if, it's when, because it will. Especially with a foodborne illness, you want to have that crisis in place because you're going to have people call. So I'll never forget, so we had a lady, she called, and she called the hotel and she said, hey, I was staying at the hotel last week and I got sick from your restaurant, from your in-room dining. And so the guy said, okay, sorry to hear that. And the one thing is, you never go, oh, we did it. You never take that ownership. You just go, okay, I apologize. And you keep moving forward and let me look into that. So the guy, our security guy, started looking into it, and he started looking at logs. And so they had places, they had the staff trained in place to start to look for these kind of things. So when the lady checked in the lobby, she came in and she checked into her room, and the person checking her in said, hey, you don't look like you feel well. And she said, no, you know what? I've had this virus. I've been sick for a few days. They typed it in. They made sure that upon her arrival, she came in sick. They typed it in and it was there. So when she tried to blame us for being that she had gotten foodborne illness, we said, hey, you came in here and guess what? You said you were sick. And so that took away any kind of lawsuit that could have happened. But trust me, people are calling all the time. Oh, I got sick. And if you don't have these things in place, guess what? You're going to pay out money. So it's really making sure of that. So you want to have, if you have an outbreak, what's going to happen? You want to develop, we already have the food safety program in place. You want to train your staff on policies. You want to create an incident report. And what are the guidelines? So if you have a foodborne illness, you got to gather your crisis team and you got to collect the information. So when did this happen? Is the food still on property? Because if the food's still on property, you need to go grab the food and you got to wrap it up and you got to place it in a corner. Let's say it's something that needs to be in a cooler. It needs to be wrapped up, placed in a cooler, because the authorities are going to come and they're going to check it. Especially if you've had an outbreak where it's affected more than 2 people. So they're going to come and they're going to check it and they're going to see what's happening. Is there E. coli? What is it that's in it? And they're going to take it to the laboratories to see what that is. You want to make sure that if you take a complaint, that you take it seriously, but you don't take ownership of it. Don't admit responsibility. That's the biggest thing. Nobody, whoever takes the phone call does not take that. There are similar customer complaints, especially if you remember an outbreak has to be 2 or more people that ate the same thing, okay, to have the outbreak. If the suspected food is still in the operation, you set it aside. Like I said, you label it, do not use, do not discard, and log the information. If the suspected outbreak is caused by a sick staff member, you need to maintain a list of food that the staff member handled, interview them about their health status, and exclude the suspected staff member from the operation immediately. And then you need to also let the regulatory know about it. You got to let the health department know about it. To recover from the foodborne illness, work with the regulatory authorities to resolve issues, clean and sanitize, throw out any suspected food, review food, and then you're waiting for them to say that you're good to operate, that it's safe and that the operation is safe to do. Imminent health hazards here, a significant threat or danger to health that requires immediate corrective action or closure to prevent injury. The ideal is you want to just stop service. Service has to stop immediately, notify the regulatory authority, and throw out spoiled or contaminated food. Include your food that is not packaged. To prepare for a power outage, if there's a power outage, you need to make sure arranging access to electrical generator and for refrigerator. you know, I knew a chef that was down in Florida, and they said when the hurricanes were coming, they literally emptied the coolers. They didn't keep anything in there because they didn't have a generator to keep that. A lot of big properties will have generators, so you don't have to worry about that, but some properties don't. Preparing a menu with items that don't require cooking, developing a policy to address the coolers when the cooler doors are down. Services may be allowed after water electrical interruptions. It has to be pre-approved written. You want to make sure that there's a corrective action and it notifies the regulatory authority. Now, here's what I want you guys to know. Starting on chapter 10, on these slides, especially the 44, the last couple slides, I need you to know that there are questions like this on the certification exam. There's something about what happens, you know, if your restaurant has a sewage backup. What do you got to do? Well, if it's right there in the middle of the kitchen, you got to shut the kitchen down. So pay attention to these slides is my point. To respond to a power outage, you want to make sure that your refrigeration equipment, if it stopped working, you want to try and know what kind of time it is or get everything out of there immediately. I can't tell you how many times that, you know what, I've come in and I didn't know how long it was that the cooler had been down or the freezer had been down. The nice thing with these big coolers is that if the door stays closed, it will keep a temperature. It doesn't, you don't, all of a sudden it doesn't, you know, go skyrocketed that it's 70 degrees all of a sudden 2 hours later. It keeps for hours. So it's just kind of looking and knowing what temperature it's at, where, you know, what's going on. If your power outage, if the ventilation hoods or fans stop working, you got to stop cooking because you have no way to vent in the kitchen. So you got to be careful with that. If your hot holding equipment stops working, record the power outage. You're going to always hold it. You can hold it. Remember, you got 6 hours to hold something. No, hot hold is 4 hours. You got 4 hours to hold it without a temperature, but it's got to be above the 135 degrees. What do we got? Water. Here we go. Water service interruption. Prepare a menu that requires little or no water. If you lose that, you can use bottled water. You need to make sure that you can supply water and you have emergency ice if you need it. You have emergency contact information, develop procedures that minimize the water usage, and that you let the regulatory authority know about it. If hands cannot be washed, you need to implement an emergency hand washing procedure. You got to have your hands being washed. You got to have the gloves, all of that. If toilets do not flush, you can't have, if there's no restaurant, if there's no open bathroom, you need to stop you have to stop operation. So especially if you're in-service place, because you can't have people, because people will, you know. You got to be careful. Drinking water is not available or is contaminated. You're using bottled water or a reputable supplier. And if that's not, you're going to be closing down. You got to have water. Food items that require water during preparation cannot be made. Throw out any ready-to-eat food. You got to be able to use bottled or boiled water. I'll never forget when I was at school. This was up at Le Cordon Bleu, and we, all of a sudden, somebody hit a water main or something, and all the water was brown, and we couldn't use it. And so, you know, we were having to boil water to make sure that it was safe to use to wash. And, you know, after a couple hours, we just shut it all down because you just had to. It was, you know what, you can't just not have good water. If ice cannot be made, throw out any existing ice and get ice from a reputable supplier. So if your ice machine dies. Equipment and utensils or facility cannot be cleaned or sanitized. You want to make sure that you have that. To recover from a water service interrupt, clean and sanitize the equipment. spray mist, coffee urns, flush the water lines, and then you got to work with the regulatory authorities so that you can resume normal working business. So you got to have them come in and check everything. If you're preparing for a fire, fire and police departments, regulatory authorities, they all need to be phoned, and they need to be in immediately. To recover from a fire, you got to throw out whatever food was affected, throw out any damaged utensils and linen, clean and sanitize. The whole place has to just go through being specialized because again, the Ansel system, it's horrible. It's nasty to clean, and they got to check those lines. If you have floods, you got to plan to monitor your equipment and have that in place. A water line leaks or the water builds up on the floor, you got to repair the leak, keep people away from the floor or block any areas. If it's not in an area that people are cooking, then you can just block that area and have somebody come in and fix it. Flood affected or damages to food and utensils, you got to stop all operations. Okay, the flood is the result of a sewage backup. You got to close the affected area right away. Know this one because it's on your certification too. So you got to clean it, you got to correct it, and you can't have anybody in there. And if it's in the middle of your kitchen, you got to shut down the whole kitchen. Whole kitchen gets shut down. And that is chapter 10. It's a long chapter. But those things you got to know. All right. Study the HACCP, study some of the sewage stuff that I told you in the floods, and you'll be good with that. I hope you're doing well. Talk to you soon. Bye.